Good afternoon to all, and welcome. It is just great to see this full house, and hello to everybody who is remotely listening to us. Thank you for the WEF delegates who have come and skipped all their glamorous lunch invitations, and a special welcome to all of our community members, and particularly happy to see so many young people. So thank you for joining on what is a very complicated issue. Our title today is Immigration, Welcomed or Not? And the answer, of course, depends largely upon who you are and where you live and what your life experiences have been. But today, we are fortunate to have with us an extraordinary panel of experts, and I'm happy to share their insights and their common and non-common views. Consensus on this topic is tough, and there's certainly no easy solutions. But our goal today, my goal at least, is that we all leave this room better informed than when we came. We'll also be giving the audience a chance to pose questions, so get them ready. And it's not every day, and I'm sure the Secretary General will be here, that we all get to ask questions to the Secretary General, who continues to advocate for the poorest and most needy in society in remarkable ways. We're going to be joined, we are joined today, by one of the world's leading experts on demography. I'm the founding director of the Whitkinson Center and leader of the World Population Program, YASA. Thank you and welcome, Professor Wolfgang Lentz. And to my right is Ambassador William Lacey Swings, who's been an ambassador 6 times, actually, and is currently the Director General of the International Organization for Migration. And he has also led many peacekeeping operations, including the largest ever by the UN for the Republic of Congo. Welcome, Ambassador. Thank you. And directly to my left is President Martin Schulz, elected European Parliament President in 2012 with a long history, more than 20 years as the leader of the Social Democratic Party in Germany and many, many years of experience in the public sector. Welcome, Mr. President. And finally, to my extreme left, formerly the Attorney General of Ireland and head of the WTO, and appointed by the then Secretary General Kofi Annan in 2006 to be the special representative to the UN on migrations and development, where he has continued to develop a worldwide coordinated UN plan on migration. Welcome to the Special Representative, Mr. Sutherland. Thank you. I don't really think any of these panelists actually needed these introductions, as probably the only one up here that most of you don't know is me. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be your moderator. My name is Amy Rosen, and my day job, I run a global NGO called the Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship, known as NIFTY, where we have worked with about 500,000 young people from challenging circumstances, helping to unlock their entrepreneurial mindset and giving them the knowledge and skills to be successful as entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial employees. Several hundred thousands of them are first and second generation immigrants, so suffice it to say this topic is near and dear to my heart. There are few topics, hot topics, that trigger as many heated discussions everywhere in the world than immigration. What are the real costs of immigration, and not just the economic costs, but also the impacts on society? Whatever country you look at in the U.S., where I come from, the so-called land of immigrants, both political parties spend most of their time using immigration on one side or another as a point getter. It's a problem of epic proportions around the borders of Syria today, and it's a huge topic in many Asian countries. And today, which is what our focus is going to be, it's causing massive political headaches here in Europe and the EU, where immigration's on the rise. As the European southern borders, there are deep concerns over the steady influx of immigrants from Africa and the Middle East. And in some of the northern countries like Germany and the stronger economies, they're openly recruiting for both within the EU and outside the EU to bring tech-savvy skills that they much need. Among all the EU countries, there's currently a highly charged debate of what the economic impact is going to be of the newly lifted restrictions on freedom of, or the restrictions on freedom of movement that have been lifted for the citizens of Bulgaria and Romania. And they've, for people who know much more about this than I do, just looking at the papers on it, it would be impossible to figure out the facts because the facts on both sides of the debate seem to be so different. Right here in Switzerland, there's a referendum coming out on in the near future on that would impose restrictions on immigration, and the largest political party in the Federal Assembly's platform is really built around strong opposition to immigration. It's a big topic, and there are no simple answers. To get us started, just throw out that depending on how we count, and I get scared about counting in front of Professor Lutz, but there are, however you count the immigrants, there's a basic consensus that of the recent immigrants to Europe, if you look at them a year later, about 50% of them are unemployed. And also, and another interesting study that recently came out, that confirmed what is one of the best kept secrets, which is that the immigrants who are coming are generally, by the vast majority, not the poor and the poorest, but fall much more in the middle economies and the above. With that, let me get our group started, and I'm going to encourage people to communicate with each other, and let me, Special Representative, kick it off with you, since you've been working on this plan for a long time, and ask you to talk a little bit about the conflict with migration and European integration.
Well, yeah, to respond to that.
Welcome. If I may, welcome Secretary General, and we are just about to launch with your special representative appointed to the UN with some of his thoughts and findings.
Well, first of all, let me say that you were correct in saying that this is one of the most important issues facing the global community at the current time, and it's going to become more important rather than less. In the European context, it's already evident that in the European elections, which will be on us shortly, there has been a significant rise in support for parties which I would consider to be advocating xenophobic responses rather than positive responses to migration. I think that this is extremely unfortunate, and I think it's time that the debate was carried directly to those who advocate these positions. If one looks at the likely result in some of the major countries in Europe, the United Kingdom, with the rise of UKIP, in France, Le Pen, Austria, one can look at 21% of the last poll. Right across Europe, there is a negative view about migration, which not merely contradicts some of the values which many of us associate particularly with the European Union, but more generally with civilized society, but which also reflect a point of view which is grossly distorted as to the impact and effect of migration on societies. The reality is that the evidence is overwhelming that migration plays a very positive role in the development of countries, and that migrants generally play a positive and constructive role in economic activity. And the perceptions are totally out of line with reality. In the United States, for an example, the German Marshall Fund conducted a poll as to what people thought the actual numbers of migrants were. And the general polling result was that Americans thought that 42% of the population of the United States were immigrants. The actual figure is 13%. You have the same type of response, nothing like as exaggerated as that in other countries, where there is a perception that things are changing in a way which is simply not true. We've had the same debate in the United Kingdom about the effect of Bulgarian and Romanian migrants coming in huge numbers, which was postulated as a theory during the latter part of last year, and which is tying into an anti-European position on the EU, which is simply not true. So I think that there is a real need for people to frankly and fully debate and discuss migration as it really is. Because there are countries in Europe who have created a far more constructive engagement with this debate. I could take Sweden as an example. There are many others. Indeed, Germany's figures in terms of public perception and attitude to migration are much better than they are in some other countries. I'm not going to trespass on a debate in regard to Switzerland, because I don't know the detail about Switzerland. But I do know that migration is going to move within the next 20 or 30 years from a from a very large number today, whatever it is, 232 million, to perhaps 400 million, whatever way one looks at it. I do also know that demographics demands a constructive engagement with this problem, not a negative one.
Thank you. Let me turn it to Mr. President over here. How do you reconcile that as the President of the Parliament with what we know from polls and everything else, that the vast majority of Europeans are deeply concerned about jobs and taxes and culture? How do you create a framework to get to be able to have a dialogue around the facts and actually drive good policy? And are there any consensus emerging within the Parliament around how to do this?
To find sustainable solutions, the European Parliament is the easiest place. There is an overwhelming majority of people, except those you mentioned, in favor of a constructive and an immigration policy in Europe as a whole, to the European Union as a whole, taking into account all these very heterogeneous elements you just mentioned. Quite sure a society in which you have not these unbalances we have for today in some of the member states of the European Union and between the member states of the European Union. In such a society, the majority of people who feel to be threatened by the economic development to lose ground, to lose their usual frame, not to be a millionaire, but to have a decent life. In such societies, immigrants are often taken and considered as an additional threat. That means a condition to make a society more able to accept immigrants is a society in which economic stability is guaranteed. And that's one of the biggest problems we have in the European Union for the time being. This is, by the way, a difference in my eyes to the debate here in Switzerland. The immigration problem in Switzerland is a result of the enormous economic success of the country. Switzerland is one of the most successful countries in the world economically. Enterprises coming to this, what the Switzerland call the Unterland, draw successful enterprises behind them, and they need people, and these people are coming from the member states of the European Union. But this is leading to elements I understand. Every day, 1 hour in a traffic jam is not easy. Increasing ground prices is not easy. So the feeling of to be overcrowded in Switzerland is a result of economic success. In other countries, the refusal of immigrants is a result of economic failure. So we have to take into account very different circumstances very heterogeneous and varies from country to country to give an answer. But one answer we must give, and not in the European Parliament alone, in all institutions of the European Union, especially in the governments of the member states, is the following answer to a question I raise. Is the European Union a continent? Is Europe a continent? Is the Union a union of immigration or not? This is a basic question. And you will find a lot of people who tell me, no way. We are not a region of immigration. My answer to them is look to the Mediterranean, then you see that we are a region of immigration. The question is which kind of immigration we want to have. And I was disappointed that the member states of the European Union believe that we can continue to solve our immigration problems with the Dublin Convention. The Dublin Convention is an element of protection for political refugees. But a lot of people who are coming are not political refugees. I try to argue that the European Union is not overcharged with too much burdens. I just, the day before yesterday, met in Brussels the Prime Minister of Turkey. Turkey has 700,000 refugees from Syria. Germany is 60,000. But if I compare the debate in Germany with the debate in Turkey, okay, it's not necessary to continue. So, the problem is the European Union must recognize that we are a continent of immigration, that we have three problems to manage. First of all, protection for political refugees. I think this is covered by the Dublin Convention. It could be improved, but from a principal point of view, we have a rule obliging the member states of the European Union to protect political refugees. Secondly, we need a better and an improved temporary protection for those people who are coming from civil war regions, from natural disaster regions, and who want to stay for a limited time in the European Union to get back. Good example, Switzerland and France and Germany is always the Lebanon. When I was a young mayor in Germany 25 years ago, we had a lot of refugees from Lebanon. All these people, after the civil war was finished, went back and contributed to reconstruct the country, which is, by the way, once more threatened today. And that will happen with the Syrian refugees as well. But the third element is, in the globalized world in which we are living, mobility, migration is a normal thing. And therefore, the European Union has to take the consequences. All big areas of the world, all regions with traditional immigration have. The United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand have rules for legal immigration. What we allow is an overwhelming illegal process instead to install a legal process. That means to recognize we are a continent of immigration and we need a rule. If you want to immigrate in your country to the United States, you can apply. You are put on a list, and sooner or later, most of the cases later,
I was just going to say we shouldn't get into a debate of whether the U.S. has this right yet. Let me let you finish.
You get a chance of access.
Yeah.
And that needs, within the European Union, the preparedness of the member states to define who should, under which circumstances, come to which country. Because not all people can go to one country in the European Union. Therefore, we need an agreement between the member states who can go to which country under which circumstances, but that should be based on a common rule, and the precondition is to recognize that immigration is existing.
So I see you landing up and on this question of, are we a region of free immigration or not, as an advocate for controlled immigration in some senses. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but let me, if I may, turn to the Secretary General. As a lifetime humanitarian and advocate for the poor, and certainly somebody who has managed so much complicated migration policy, what advice do you have for our European policymakers here? And if in fact the special representative's point of view that which seems, I think probably everybody would agree with, that there's an awful lot of misinformation. How do you actually create an environment where you can actually work on behalf of good things?
Thank you very much. Let me say that I agree with most of what has been said, that migration will continue. we are not going to be able to stop it. It's been going on for a long time, and it will continue. What is important is to manage the migration process. There should be rules, but it should be managed in a manner that is in the interest of the country of origin, country of transition, and the country of final destination, as well as the interest of the refugee himself or herself. As Peter said, refugees bring with them lots of advantages. Even when you look at the United States, you have incredible number of entrepreneurs who are immigrants, innovators who are immigrants. And this, in fact, reminds me of a poster UNHCR used to have when I used to work with them a long time ago. It showed them Einstein at the border trying to cross into a country with a sack of clothes on his back. And the caption was, "A sack of clothes is not the only thing the immigrant brings." And I think that tells a very interesting story that all of us could have examples of. I think we need to be honest and tell the population what it is. For some countries, in times of prosperity, they go and beg the government to allow in more immigrants and more foreign workers. In times of crisis, they say they are taking jobs from us. And these are jobs the locals don't want to do anyway, but they use it as a political means to keep the argument going, to get votes. But if the politicians and the leaders and all of us were to get engaged and explain what actually it means, it's not easy for people to just get up and leave their homes. It takes lots of courage to do this. And of course, I agree that there are various types of migrants. You have the political migrants, you have the economic migrants, you have the refugees, and you need to have some measure of control. But what is not acceptable is sometimes the ways some of these migrants are treated. It's not acceptable that they are pushed out to sea or we see them drowning. And we are told there are ships out there looking out for them, looking out to expel them or looking out to save them from drowning. And I think the tide is changing, and public uproar with some of the things which have happened in Lampedusa, telling the world, we simply do not treat other human beings like this. It's happening. I thought we had learned our lesson after the Vietnam boat people's crisis, but we are repeating it not only here, but in other locations of the world. And yet we live in a globalized world, and this movement will continue. I had the opportunity of talking to the European Parliament some years ago when I was given the Sakharov Award. And I stressed the fact that what is required is managing the immigration and the immigrants themselves being ready to adapt and integrating them to the as soon as possible. One parliamentarian, I think you all know him, Pasquale of France, he said, Mr. Secretary General, don't you think instead of receiving them here, we should give them development assistance and let them stay at home? It will help. Development assistance will help. But the evidence also shows that when people move up the ladder and they are educated and they are getting a better life, they also know what's happening on the other side of the world and the opportunities there and would want to move. I mean, in my own country, 60% of the doctors trained in Ghana are working outside Ghana because they quadruple or triple their salaries. So there are issues here that we need to deal with. But the main thing is, let's treat our fellow human beings decently and come up with proper rules for managing migration. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me turn over to our demographer here and ask you if you could help tell us a story a little bit from a longer view perspective. What do the numbers tell us in terms of where we're going and what the challenges are?
Okay, thank you. As a demographer dealing with longer-term population trends, I think it's worth noticing that migration has always been an integral part of the human existence since earliest times. Tribes and then later whole nations, like in times of mass migration, have moved from one place to another. And migration streams can reverse. Let's just remind ourselves that about a century ago, there was massive European outmigration to North America. People from Swiss mountain villages like Davos, as well as Austria, as well as now very rich Nordic countries in very large numbers, because of poverty, were driven out of their countries and moved mostly to North America and Australia. And so this is all part of a bigger picture that we call the demographic transition. And some countries are earlier on, they have first declining death rates, declining mortality, and then later on, they follow with lower birth rates. But in between, there's big population growth. And that's what we experienced in Europe in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and which is now being experienced in Africa and parts of Asia. Other parts of Eastern Asia, they're already more advanced. There the birth rates have declined very rapidly. And then as the birth rate declines and population live longer, life expectancy increases, there's population aging, and ultimately we will see in many countries population shrinking. So this is a process that sort of universally goes over the last 1.5 centuries, and we expect this to continue in the future. By the way, this also results that sometime in the middle of the second half of the century, 2060, 2070, we don't know exactly, we do expect a peaking of world population and then a slight decline, and then into the 22nd century. Of course, it's too far away to make any statement, but it's important in the context of sustainable development. We could well see a declining world population. And some of the countries here in Europe and Japan are spearheading the decline in population. And as had been mentioned before, of course, in that situation, I would say sort of mature populations that are in the late phases of this demographic transition, they experience population aging. It means there are fewer young people, and there's an increasing number of elderly people. Now, we have to be careful not to choose any sort of fixed limits, the population above age 65 and below age, and have dependency ratio, because we need to have a much more dynamic view on what is aging. Of course, people today are in a much better health situation at the age of 60 or 70 than they were several decades before. So it's not automatic that as societies on average get older, they will also work to a less extent, and there's a real shortage in the labor market. But clearly, although we can say 70 is the new 60, there will not in the near future be 90, the new 60. So this is a slow process. And it's clear that given this massive speed of population aging, there can be expected a shortage of the European labor market. Also, there will be automation, there will be improvements in productivity, but still it's unlikely that every work will be replaced by a robot. Much of personal care and personal communication and advice needs to be done by real human beings, and there probably will not be enough such human beings in those rapidly aging countries. So this, in the big picture, says clearly confirms what has been said before. Migration has almost been with us as humans and will likely be with us in the future. And there are some timing sequences. Maybe that's an additional fact that needs to be taken into consideration. At the moment, the baby boom, the big cohorts in Europe, are still part of the workforce. And so the proportion of the workforce as part of the total population is relatively advantageous. And of course, we do have high unemployment at the moment. But we can see with near certainty that over the next 10, 15 years, these big cohorts will retire, and then there will be many fewer workers. So maybe migration policies should also take these changes, these temporal irregularities into account. The nice thing in a way about regulated migration is that you can have a better handle. You can bring in the people when they are needed. And this is much more difficult with having influence on the birth rate, if it is at all possible, because then it takes more than 25 years until sort of higher birth rates translates into more skilled adult people. And I want to conclude and now just give a new dimension to this, that one dimension that has been disregarded very much in the international migration discussion, to my view, is the education level. It's just fundamentally different whether we're talking about a more educated migrant who can much more easily integrate into the new society, or less educated migrants. And also, I think we'll talk about this notion of circular migration, benefiting from migration from people going back and forth between the countries, bringing some skills back to their home countries that is much more pronounced among the more educated people. So I want to add this education dimension here as well.
Thank you, thank you. Ambassador, we listened to the Secretary General talk about the need to manage the...
May I say something?
Yeah, yeah.
One word about the education. I think the attempts to look for trained workers from the developing world is a real problem for them. I mentioned en passant that in my own country, 60% of the doctors trained in Ghana are working abroad. They've been attracted by better conditions, and yet we have serious health situation. Nurses are being wooed and drafted abroad from Philippines, from Ghana, from Nigeria, which creates constant problems for the hospitals. We don't hear about that side. Yeah. We only focus on the benefits we get in Europe or the States, but what happens to the others?
I entirely agree, and that's why I also emphasized this issue of circular migration as a possible remedy against this brain drain, coming back, bringing the skills back, benefiting both the sending and the receiving societies.
Interesting, good. Mr. Ambassador, when we talk about sort of managed migration and treating our fellow human beings with the dignity that they deserve, you've managed so many tough situations with such large numbers of migration people. Would you talk to us a little bit, and then sort of as we think about what's going on with Bulgaria and Romania right now in the European Union, where have you seen things work, and how do we bring that same kind of process of which you can build consensus among many countries, which you have to do to implement it?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me come at this from a much more general angle. I'd like to, having had the very rich introductions by esteemed colleagues here, I'd like to state a thesis and then give you some background to support it. My thesis is that large-scale migration is already and is likely to be a mega trend of the 21st century. As you mentioned, the population will begin decline sort of around mid-century, 2060 perhaps, but for the moment, it's a mega trend. Therefore, large-scale migration is inevitable, it is necessary, and if we properly manage it or properly govern it, it is highly desirable. I'll add one more part to that, which is that migration historically has been overwhelmingly positive. It's still true today. Now, I say it's inevitable because of demography. I stand to be corrected by my colleague to my right, but the 20th century was the first century in recorded history in which the world's population has quadrupled. Now, the percentage of people migrating has remained fairly constant at about a little over 3% during all this period, but the number of people has gone up. And so today, if you take the latest figures, 232 million international migrants, persons crossing an international border, and about 740 million domestic migrants, China alone has as many domestic migrants as there are international migrants, for example. So the combination means that you have 1 billion migrants, so that using the latest global figures, 1 out of 7 persons on the globe is a migrant, some form of migratory status. And I think it's important to recognize that that's going to drive things for a long time to come. We're in the middle of the digital revolution. We had, 300 million people connected to the internet at 2000? Today, it's in excess of 2 billion, pushing toward 3. I suppose if Mark Zuckerberg gets its way, it'll go to 7. So people know what's going on. They know where to go, where to avoid, how to get there, budget travel, and various other things. And as said, it's not the poorest of the poor. It's people with some means that are able to migrate. Now, juxtaposed against that is the presentations that we've already had, that much of the industrialized world has taken a counter-cyclical approach to it and adopted an anti-migrant attitude. Why? I think it's being driven by a number of forces, but number one, it's driven by the global financial and economic crisis. It is not true that migrants are taking jobs away from natives. They're doing jobs that the natives don't want to do, starting off at that at least. Dirty, difficult, and dangerous. So you have that. You have, secondly, the post-9/11, I guess you call it the post-9/11 security syndrome, in which security becomes sort of the tail that wags the dog, and there's a lot of fear. Maybe they're bringing terrorism in. And then finally, you have personal fear of loss of identity and national fear of loss of identity, as if there are any monoethnic societies left in the world in this modern age. So it seems to me this is the direction in which we're heading, and we need to think about migration not in the traditional terms, movement from A to B, but in terms of human mobility. And so you end up with, I think, very much the policies that a number of countries are beginning to follow. You try to reduce and keep at a minimum irregular migration, people who fall into the hands of traffickers and smugglers. You try to facilitate the movement of people who have proper papers and know where they're going, etc. And then you try to protect the human rights of all migrants. They're all human beings. And then you can avoid what's just happened in Lampedusa and Malta, where I was recently. The Pope himself was there. You can avoid incidents like we've had in the Sahel, crossing the desert trying to get to jobs. So finally, I guess what I'm saying is some of the things that have already been said, which is we need to be looking at migration as human mobility, and we need to be adopting what I can only call a high road scenario that brings into play policies that make sense, that are reasonable, that are humane, and that work both in the interest of the migrant, but actually in the national interest. Now, unfortunately, and I'll stop here, unfortunately, there is not a great deal of political courage out there right now on this issue, because migration today is not an issue that is likely to bring in votes. It's more likely to risk losing them. But frankly, it's going to take that, because with an aging North that needs jobs to be filled and a youthful South which is not producing a lot of jobs, more and more people will appear on your doorstep or on your shores that perhaps don't look exactly like you, or maybe speak with an accent, or maybe have mores that you don't understand. But if they're properly welcomed and allowed to integrate, they just might very well share the same values that you and I share. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to just try to roll this up into some big generalizations of where I think we have some consensus, and then move it on to the audience for their own questions. So it seems to me that that all of you have agreed that large-scale migration is a megatrend and inevitable, necessary, desirable, needs to be managed well, needs to be managed humanely. Tough to swallow for host countries with weak economies and job issues. Real risk of extreme politics if we don't find a way to have an honest, open debate, and that we're in big need of political courage out there to lead. Saying all that, does anybody disagree or want to quickly add anything?
No, I think you would want to pose a question. Is it possible to have a free movement of capital and goods, but no free movement of people?
Well done. Yeah.
It's the key question.
And anybody in the audience feels free to take your opportunity for a question, to answer that question as well. So I would ask everybody to identify themselves, and since the audience is so big and the line is long, to limit yourselves to one question, please. Is that the line back there for questions?
This
Or we-
red shirt, the fellow in the red shirt.
Are we doing this by hand? Yeah? Gentleman in the red shirt? Oh, exactly. Do we have any hands up? Okay, thank you, yeah. Do we have coming. Thank you.
And we get the gentleman.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Juli. I live in Germany. Mr. Secretary General, you mentioned the problem of brain drain, especially in Ghana. The question is, do you have any projects in mind, education projects in those countries which could help prevent this dilemma? And the second question is, do you have any projects in mind for us here in Europe we could start to become more sensible and maybe also help prevent this problem of brain drain? Thank you.
It's an interesting question. I personally do not have a project to stop or to encourage reverse brain drain. Quite a few bright young African women and men who have been trained working abroad here in Europe and in the US and in Asia are going back. That reverse brain drain is going to be very positive for the continent. We need to find ways of accelerating the return, getting some of the trained people and others back to help. Maybe one could think of a scheme that will facilitate, in collaboration maybe with the European Union and others, that will facilitate return of these people who also would have the capacity to create institutions and possibly jobs. It's not going to be easy. They will look at it also from the individual level. It's not something that an institution can take on. They know how much they are earning in Germany or in the US, and they know how much they will get in Ghana. So you have to have the incentives for them. In an interesting sort of way, China has been able to do that with lots of Chinese scientists and others who have gone home, and conditions provided for them, in some cases institutes set up for them to continue their work. But Africa is not that rich yet. So if we're going to do that sort of thing, we need to look at collaborative schemes.
Yes, I'd just like to make one point about the brain drain issue. It's a very much more complicated issue than might appear superficially. The first point is that if the possibility of migration, which incidentally, in my view, takes on incidents of being a human right, which cannot be managed by depriving people of opportunities because of arguments on brain drain. But the first point I think has to be made is that when the opportunity to travel as a doctor or as a Filipino nurse, for an example, is available, it stimulates people in that society to be educated. It has a positive effect on the number of people who are studying to be doctors, many of whom do remain behind. The Philippines is a country with a very advanced perception of the value of migration, not merely to the individuals, but to the home society, because it stimulates the Filipino people to be educated, and in terms of those who do leave, by the provision of an enormous amount of money, which is far greater than the total of development aid and indirect and foreign direct investment combined, which is the remittance flow that comes back from those migrants. So I'm against the basic argument that brain drain is a negative to migration. I think it has a positive, it has obviously some negative effects, but overall, education and the opportunity to be a doctor working in other countries in the world stimulates the educational system of the developing country in question. And I think that some European countries are making a particular effort to link into the educational system of developing countries. For example, Spain is doing quite a lot in Africa to stimulate education and to bring about a positive relationship between migration, even of skilled people, and their home society, and the diaspora effect subsequently that this brings about.
Thank you. Ambassador?
I agree with you.
Just a very quick word on this. I think these are all the right points to make. Two other points I would make, and the main one is that we also need to think about brain circulation. I mean, this again, if you have policies that facilitate movement and mobility, we live in a world, all of us these days tend to have multiple identities, but you can't use that other identity if you have a one-entry visa. You got to be able to get back and forth. And people come back on their vacations, they come back, they teach in hospitals, they do various things, and some of them actually come back home. Many of them do. So we ought to think of it in those terms. Secondly, we have a large program called Return of Qualified Nationals. We've returned about 140 highly qualified Somalis to Mogadishu in a very difficult situation, try to help build the capacity of the government. They haven't forgotten home, but they have to be able to get back home.
Well taken. Thank you. Next point. Anyone?
Hi, I'm Rachel Richter from Switzerland. We are, sorry for my English, it's bad. I will do my best. We already talked about brains, but for those people who are in dramatical situations, you talked about Lampedusa and Sahel. Which concrete measures do you recommend for our governments in Europe? You talked about integration, but concretely, what do you recommend, Mr. Annan or Mr. Schulz?
I want to get back in answering to your question, what I said at the beginning about the responsibilities of the member states of the European Union. We have to do a double step. First of all, to recognize that the problem is existing. My biggest problem in the European Parliament is that in public debates in some of the member states of the European Union, people are simply denying the problem. They are denying the problem. Or they are considering the problem as an Italian problem. The Italians have to solve the problem. So Lampedusa is Italy, and so the first step is we must come to a common position that the problem is existing. As Mr. Annan said, migration will exist. I would say it will increase, that's for sure. And therefore we as European Union, I repeat it, need a common strategy. The common strategy of the Union, after the member states have recognized the problem as existing, should give the necessary instruments to the European institutions in these three parts I already said: political refugees, temporary protection, and legal immigration. And in the frame of legal immigration, we need a repetition between the 28 member states of the European Union. The experience is, I think, quite clear. Most of those immigrants who are coming want to go to, first of all, countries where already people from their country of origin are. It's quite clear they are looking for neighbors. Secondly, countries with a high degree of jobs and job possibilities are countries of destination, but this is not the total amount of 28 member states. This is focusing on 4 or 5 member states. But these 4 or 5 member states, for sure, alone will not manage the problem. Therefore, we need, I avoid often the term, but it is the technical term in the European public debate, burden sharing. I try to avoid the term because it is considered as a problem, as a burden. So let's say responsibility sharing. And therefore we need an agreement between the 28 member states that the Federal Republic of Germany or France gets more people than Malta. So this is quite easy to understand. And then within the member state, the biggest problem is that those institutions, those authorities who have to manage concretely integration, education, public accompaniment in welfare and in the health system, the long list of problems are local authorities, cities and regional authorities. And they must be provided by the member states with the necessary money and the necessary infrastructure and means. And this is more or less what we have to do. And it sounds nice, I know it, and the reality is completely different. And it is completely different. Here's the circle concluded, because with the problem of migration, I think you, Ambassador Swing, said it at the early beginning, and Mr. Sutherland as well, to demonize the problem has an enormous political profit. To try to be objective and to describe concrete, practical solution is more difficult and sounds not only more difficult, it is more difficult. And what we are facing for the time being in the European Union is that everything is mixed. Internal migration, free movement of capital goods and services is allowed, free movement of people not within the Union. So in UK, and not only in UK, in other countries as well, and migration to the European Union is considered as not manageable. So we need an enormous and courageous step within the European Union. I'm very grateful that I can express it here, because, to be honest, the resolutions of the European Parliament, our decisions are more or less in the sense of what we are discussing here on these podiums, and I would be very grateful if heads of states and government would join such debate publicly and publicly say if they share our view or not. But we have another burden sharing in the European Union. For the uncomfortable things, the European Parliament is in a public debate responsible. And for the comfortable things behind closed doors, the heads of states and governments say, we remain between us, and the result is no solution.
Before we move on, let me just ask everybody in the panel on behalf of the person who asked the question, does anybody have, if you could, wave a magic wand and, have one policy adopted, one thing that could really move the needle closer to, a managed and humane process? Any suggestions on one concrete idea?
Let me add to what before we go to your one idea, which I'm not sure exists, but let me say that I agree with what the President has said, but he refers to the role of leaders. I want to refer to the role of individuals, of you, because you can also play a role. As individuals, you have power. As individuals, you can push back when politicians get up and play political games, the demagogues who get sometimes 5–10% and disrupt the work of parliaments. You should be able to stand up to them and speak back. We don't. We think they are funny, they are on the fringe, and before we know, they are in the center. And they've got votes in parliament. You can also help what the President is speaking up by speaking out. And I believe if the leaders fail to lead on this issue or on any other issue, the people can make them follow. So you do have power.
I'm going to accept that as one big idea.
Well, at the danger of sounding naive, I think it's worthwhile to express a hope for the future, because the root cause really of all these issues is the inequality in income and living conditions in different parts of the world. So the long-term solution must lie in enhanced development, meeting the Millennium Development Goals. And actually, I'm quite optimistic. There has been relatively rapid progress in education, basic education around the world, in health, and many other of the relevant Millennium Development Goals. And when the economic differences, the wage differences, become smaller, in the moment it's still sort of going apart and getting bigger, but if we're going to have the end of world population growth on the horizon, if we have this rapid catching up, as we hope, of many developing countries, then we may at some point be a situation like the different countries in the European Union. We also have poor countries like Bulgaria that are losing migrants to the rest of the European Union, but still within Europe we feel in a situation that we can allow completely free movement of people. And maybe at a future state this will be the case for the world.
All right. Another question, please? Yes, to this gentleman here.
Mr. Secretary General, as a person with a positive thinking of migration, What can I answer to people when they say immigration is bad because it increases criminality?
They are stupid.
You've got your first answer. But secondly, I will say that it scapegoated the migrants. Yes, there may be criminals amongst the migrants, but they are not all criminals. And lots of criminal elements come from the local communities. But because they can be identified, they can be profiled, when an immigrant commits a crime, it takes on a whole new dimension. That is not fair to them, and it's not fair to those who are handling the situation. And I think try and get them to look at the statistics nationally as to how many crimes are committed and by which group, and don't allow them to steer you to the migrant, saying they are the only ones committing the crimes. Look at the post.
Could I add one thing? This is an often used argument, especially by extreme right-wing parties. And my recommendation is always the following. Yes, migration as it is today is increasing criminality of criminal gangs using the hopelessness of the migrants in other parts of the world. Therefore, we need legal immigration to avoid the profit of criminals by illegal immigration. That should be an answer.
Thank you.
When I was a student some years ago at the University of Tübingen, I used to go and listen to the lectures of a famous theologian named Rudolf Bultmann. Bultmann created the term called demythologizing. And I think we really need to demythologize migration. This is one of the myths right here. They're bringing a criminal element in this country. The other one is they're bringing disease in. The third one is they're coming to take our jobs, et cetera. It goes to the whole range of myths and stereotypes that really allow politicians to take advantage of the migrants. They win votes off the backs of migrants. Now, for example, if you ask, why should the whole debate about, they're putting a drain on our public services. Well, do you want unhealthy migrants in your community, or do you want healthy? I think I'd give them access to health services. Again, as we said here, do you want educated, give them access to schools or not? So the mythology and the stereotypes are doing a lot of damage to our ability to have proper migration, and we're pushing them, as President Schultz says, we're pushing them into the hands of smugglers and traffickers. And keep in mind, in terms of the international criminal network, it's much easier to run migrants than to run drugs and guns, and it's about as profitable. It's about $35 billion a year.
Thank you.
Could I make one point on this? Two specifics. First of all, if one looks at international conventions, many countries have a view, some have it very firmly embedded in them, that they are not going to get involved in international obligations in regard to migration because it interferes with national sovereignty. Well, let me give you one example of where this leads. There is now a domestic workers convention. There is one country in the Middle East which has on death row a figure of over 20 women who are on death row who are migrant workers. The Migrant Workers Convention, if you were to read it, or I were to read it out to you today, contains nothing that isn't in accordance with the basic standards of law that we all enjoy. And yet, the developed countries of the world have not been ratifying it, as a result of which no pressure is put on many others. And we all know that domestic workers are being abused all over the world. There are only 2 European countries, as far as I know, that have ratified, Italy and Germany. Where's the rest of the European Union? Take a second issue. What are we doing to regulate recruiters? Recruiters all over the world are abusing their power to entice people to go to work in another place where their rights are not protected. we in the developed world should be looking at the role of recruiters. Now, IOM is looking at this issue. And we need, therefore, there are specific things, even in the area of regulation, which people don't want to talk about, where an embracement of what is common, rational, and fair consideration of the issues of people who are suffering all over the world has to be dealt with. I was in, if I may conclude, one Middle Eastern country not too long ago, visiting the places where migrants live and work, and in one embassy there were over 30 women camping in the grounds of the embassy because they were escaping from abuse. Most of them were domestic workers, incidentally. This is an issue which politically we in the developed world have to be prepared to address and discuss.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm Viral Dupu from Switzerland. I have a question for Mr. Schulz. You said about legal immigration and control mechanism for immigration. As I understand, migration today is unfair, and legal immigration will be the same, unfair, because we in the developed countries, we take people we need, people we want, good educated people, trained people, and people who want us, who need us, are not welcome. Wouldn't this entry barrier be unfair for those who need us as well?
This is a point. I'm grateful for your question because it was a point during this debate about brain drain. I had in mind to add something in such a direction. It's quite clear. Well-skilled people, highly educated people are welcomed. And recruiters, for example, they are looking especially for such people. And my experience, I was in my first mandate in the European Parliament, a member of the Civil Liberties and Internal Affairs Committee. And I dealt a long time with this question of external border control of the European Union. And this time, I met a lot of people, illegal, or so-called illegal migrants. And looking to them, 80% of them were young people, especially young men. A lot of them better educated than I expected it. To come from a point far away, to understand the system of smugglers and traffickers, to get the money, to pay them, and then to get to Europe, needs a certain skill, a certain kind of education, a certain competence. That means the poorest and the lowest, people on the lowest education level have no chance. And those who are not so well skilled and are drawn with them, they have no chance when they arrive here. And often this is a surprising thing. Amongst the victims who will not survive are those who have no education, who cannot defend themselves. So you're right, this is an unfair thing. Once more, there is a point I have to admit also in the debate. We have to take very serious. As Secretary General Annan said, migration will exist in this 21st century in an unprecedented dimension. This globalized world leads to worldwide migration. And the Europeans, we must understand that this is not new. I learned a little bit more to understand about what we are discussing when I met the Pope. The Pope told me in a conversation, so not a core element of our debate, but he said, listen, Mr. Schulz, I am the child of legal immigrants to Argentina coming from Italy. There was in the 19th and very long time in the 20th century a European immigration to all parts of the world, to the United States, to Latin America, to Eastern Europe, wherever, in Australia. And now the Europeans are surprised that there is an immigration to Europe. From a fundamental point of view, once more, I repeat, the Europeans must recognize that we, as the richest part of the world, are for sure a goal of immigrants. And that in addition to the globalization we all have a profit of, migration will be increasing every year. And therefore it is, in my eyes, really dangerous not to come to a system of immigration in Europe. But one thing, I'm a left-winger, and I have to admit this, because this is absolutely unpopular on the left side, what I say now, but rules means rules. A rule means a limit. That means clearly we will not get all people from all parts of the world to Europe. As a friend of mine, Michel Rocard, former French Prime Minister, once said, France can't solve alone all problems of the world on his territory. So I add, if we are discussing about legal immigration, we are discussing about rules of legal immigration. Rules of legal immigration for sure will have a result, limited immigration. And therefore I want to avoid any misunderstanding. I'm for immigration in Europe, but under certain circumstances, accepting that this is a limited number of people who will come every year and will be distributed on the 28 member states of the European Union. This will be a disappointment for some people who think this is not enough, but better a controlled and well-organized immigration than an uncontrolled, unfair and criminal, illegal migration.
Last question, last question, and we'll take it from the back. There's a person with their hand up right in front of you. Yep.
Der arme Mann im roten Hemd, der hat sich schon 20 Mal gehört. Yeah, the poor man in the red shirt, he was the first one who...
Thank you for letting me to ask the question. Yes? All right. Yeah. I'm Amri from Indonesia, and I would like to get out a little bit of the European context, and thanks to Mr. Sutherland that have mentioned about the abuse of domestic workers. It's been an ongoing debate in Indonesia about how some host countries are abusing the domestic workers, for example, in Hong Kong, and we even had a moratorium of sending domestic workers to Malaysia because of the very same problems. But it's also a dilemma for the Indonesian workers of not being able to get these economic sources. But my question is, talking about the role of nation states who are actually responsible to keep the good working conditions for the workers itself. Should we put more pressures on the host countries, or is it the role of the home countries to make sure that their citizens are working properly abroad? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Who would like to take that?
Kofi Annan in 2006 sought to make an initiative to develop a comprehensive UN-based structure for dealing with economic migration as opposed to refugees, which are under UNHCR. There was significant opposition to that from a number of countries. The United States administration of the day was totally opposed. It was opposed on the basis of national sovereignty, that this was something solely for domestic law to cover. That, incidentally, is a totally changed situation with the current administration, who are actively engaged in the very initiative that Kofi Annan initiated, with which I was associated. The same line is taken by a lot of other countries, but they're a diminishing group. The reality is that there has to be an international component. I think the European Union as an institutional body is a key to this in demonstrating how this can work and how it has to work, because in this area, no country is an island. and no country can be an island. There has to be a generally accepted series of norms in terms of behavior with regard to migrants that is acceptable. And therefore, the problem that you identify is a very real one, where governments say, we're not interested in any external monitoring or any external oversight of the way we behave. This is solely for us. I don't accept it, because even in the countries with the most advanced legal systems, they have to recognize that if they deny this possibility, they deny the possibility in respect of other countries which do not have advanced and functioning legal systems. And the result are the abuses that are evident in many parts of the world today.
Want to do a time check? Yeah. So one quick question, the gentleman with the orange sweater.
We all know the me?
Yeah.
No, I think she meant me. I'm sorry.
So sorry.
We all know the International Labour Organization, ILO. Why don't we form an IMO for migration?
Quick answer, anybody on this one?
I didn't hear.
I think the question was, we all know the ILO. Why don't we call it the...
Don't we form a new IMO?
Oh,
Well,
form a new
he will be too modest to say it, but this is exactly what Bill Swing's organization is and increasingly will be.
Thank you. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna, well, excuse me, I'm gonna conclude so we can get done by 2 o'clock, if you don't mind. So, who's gonna do it?
I agree that we should not discriminate people. For example, in the Vatican, women are discriminated, and as Mr. Sutherland is going in and out in the Vatican, I would very much appreciate to improve this, and also to tell the new Pope that family planning is a human right. Only by the United States and by the Vatican, they don't accept it. That's the only two nations who don't accept family planning. And please, Dr. Lutz, Professor Lutz, you said that the population will have a gap 2060. What you did not say is that 230 million women don't have access to family planning. It's a human right, and the Vatican, and together with USA, is not giving them money to UNFPA. Kofi Annan, you said 2000, that we should have family planning access to all families. It is not the case. So every year we have 80 million unwanted pregnancies and 40 million we have abortions out of this problem. And I think the cause of the problem was not discussed today. What do you think, Professor Lutz, about this?
Well, just a quick answer since time is short. Of course, the reproductive health is now part of the Millennium Development Goals. It's an internationally agreed goal also by the Cairo Conference on Population and Development, and there's no doubt that it's a human right to have access to reproductive health services. And of course, female education comes together, and we will see this end of world population growth even earlier if there is better access to reproductive health and if the women are better empowered through education, and that will change long-term population trajectory, no doubt.
Thank you, Professor. So with that, we will conclude and get us out by 2 o'clock. If anything, I hope we started with the goal of everybody here leaving with being a little bit more knowledgeable, and if I could borrow from the ambassador's term, I do hope that we have, through this esteemed panel, demystified some of the impact of migration, and the only concluding thought that I really leave us with is that, perhaps if we spent more time celebrating the success stories of immigrants, from the Pope to the nurse to the bus driver, the political leaders might have more courage on this issue. I want to thank the World Economic Forum for putting together this opportunity to talk about this really important issue, and special thanks to all of these people up here who really, do this work day in and day out, and appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you.